Greetings. My name's Guy Dauncey, and welcome to Change the World. As you probably know, I like to invite guests on who are positive and determined about making a better future for our world. And my guest today is Seth Klein. Seth is a thinker and organizer who's been working to tackle issues of social justice, inequality, and the climate crisis for all his working life. He was the BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for over 2 decades, and he's an adjunct professor in urban studies at Simon Fraser University. So the reason in particularly I want Seth on today is he's just published this hugely important new book called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Hey, Guy. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, so let me start off the top is why do you think we need to address the climate crisis with the same kind of urgency and determination that we used to tackle World War II back in 1939?
Well, the overriding reason is because everything we've been doing for the last 3 decades isn't working. That's the opening premise of the book, is that I start off by looking at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, which you basically see as a flat line. After all the promises, all the pledges, we have run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, and where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished basically nothing. We have flattened the curve, but failed to bend the curve. And we can't keep this up or it's going to get horrific. So we need a new approach.
So what happens globally if other countries fail to get a handle on this and to tackle it? What are the implications for us?
If we fail to do this collectively, things get horrific. A world in which is catastrophic for many, which is deeply disruptive for everyone else on a scale that if we have found this COVID crisis to be disruptive, it's but a taste, and quite possibly ungovernable. So this is an existential threat, in the same way as World War II was an existential threat, and hence the parallels that I'm painting in the book.
Yeah. So World War II, because it was a visceral threat, people were able to mobilize together and get behind the government and doing stuff. So what is stopping people from understanding how visceral this threat is? And I know we have when the forest fires hit in British Columbia and the sky is yellow and the sun is this bizarre disk of sort of, people realize at some unconscious level that this is wrong. There's something wrong with this here. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, we go back to normal. It's shuffle by and forget about it.
Well, first of all, Guy, let me push back on the first part of your question, because, of course, I can tell from your accent that you're from England. And if you were in Europe in World War II, it was indeed a clear and present danger. If you were in Canada at the outset of World War II, the threat was not clear and present. It was on the other side of 2 oceans.
That's true.
And my sense is Canadians in the lead up to late 1939 probably looked at events unfolding in Europe the same way that today we might look at what's happening in the Philippines under Duterte or in Brazil under Bolsonaro and shake our head and feel terrible, but it's someone else's problem. And so an opening premise that I'm making in the book is that, in fact, it took leadership to get the public on board in the same way as we need today. You're right, though, that one of the curse of the climate to the war relative to COVID is that it moves in slower motion. And that certainly allows both all of us as individuals and our leaders to kick the can down the road. But I also think, you talk about extreme weather events that many of us have started to experience. I actually think the terrain of public opinion has started to shift in the last 3 years, where it has moved from, the climate threat has moved from something that we think will happen somewhere else sometime in the future to here and to now. An increasing majority of Canadians now see that. And one of the things I'm saying in the book is, let's talk about these events as attacks on our soil in the same way as we might think of a war. But remember, let me just mention about COVID, because that's the fresher memory than the war. We can all think about what happened in the early weeks there in March that galvanized us and shifted the zeitgeist so that we actually saw it as an emergency. Some people, it was the cancellation of the NBA season, and people are like, oh my goodness, this is serious. But it was also the prime minister in front of his house every morning.
Yes.
And that's how you start Emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies in order for that galvanization to occur.
Yeah. So you've got a whole list of lessons from World War II at the beginning of the book, which is adopt an emergency wartime mindset to do whatever it takes, rally the public at every turn, embrace economic planning, create the crown corporations necessary to get it done. So what I loved about this is your thinking goes much bigger. So instead of looking at the task of how do we retrofit all our homes, and you think, oh, we'll do a little incentive here and there, you say, no, what the heck? Form a big crown corporation and make it happen.
Yes. Well, when I mentioned off the top that all we've managed to do is flatline our emissions, when I reflect on, well, why is that? And I think the answer is when you survey all the federal and provincial actions to date on climate, what they all have in common is that they're voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we send price signals, we offer rebates. That's not what you do in an emergency. In an emergency, you require change. So, I've done many, many interviews now since the book came out, and I've been forced to kind of distill my whole list of World War II lessons into a shorter list when people ask me, how do you know when a government is actually in emergency mode? And so for me, there's 4 markers now. One, you spend what it takes to win. 2, you create new economic institutions to get the job done, like your point about crown corporations. In the war, C.D. Howe, the minister in charge of military production, created 28 crown corporations. Justin Trudeau has created 2 crown corporations in his time in office, the Infrastructure Bank, which is a privatization vehicle for infrastructure. And you know what the other one is? It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. That's it. So you create new economic institutions to get the job done, because if you don't create new crown corporations, the best we can do is try to incentivize somebody else to do what has to be done instead of just doing it ourselves. So that's the second marker. The third marker is you move from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory policies as required with clear near-term dates. And finally, number 4, you tell the truth about the nature of the crisis. And you're forthright about that. And Canada did all of those things in the Second World War. But also, if we think about what we've just been through with COVID, I actually think the Trudeau government hits all 4. We can quibble about whether or not they all happened, the timing was right and so on, but they were doing all 4. On climate, I don't think we have a single federal or provincial government in Canada that hits any of the 4. That's what's got to change.
Yeah. I mean, the BC government would say, for instance, they're doing a mandatory approach to electric vehicles. They're saying that by 2040, every new vehicle must be electric. And they're claiming global leadership for that. Well, Britain has just reduced the date to 2030. To me, a date set in 2040 is the message to say, oh, go to sleep, doesn't matter, someone else's shift, I'll be retired by then.
That's right. Well, and in fact, you're doing the opposite of communicating emergency. When you set a target so far out, you're actually communicating a confusing message that you don't really see it as an emergency. So let me clarify that third marker. Make mandatory measures at clear near-term dates.
Yes.
So it's true that the good part of Clean BC, and let me recognize that Clean BC is probably the most robust, it's the high water mark in terms of climate policies in Canada, which isn't saying much because it's not a climate emergency plan. The good piece of it is that it starts to set regulatory requirements like the zero emission vehicle mandate for 2040, saying all new buildings need to be carbon zero by 2032. But the dates are completely out of whack. They're not aligned with the emergency.
I mean, right now on buildings, builders are still building new homes heated by natural gas.
That's right.
And natural gas is as bad as coal. Because of the fracking and the methane emissions, it's as bad as coal, and we're still doing it, and it's normalized.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And I've said to our environment minister, getting homes to fuel swap to electric heat pumps is a key piece of hitting Clean BC's targets. But I'm quite certain that there are more people building new buildings tying into gas than there are buildings claiming the credit and fuel swapping to electric heat pumps. So right out of the gate, we're missing a key target. And that's why instead we need a crown corporation, a new crown corporation or a subsidiary of BC Hydro that's mass producing HFC-free heat pumps, an army of installers who come to our homes, get the profit margin out of it, get the economies of scale, make it easy,
Yeah.
and then set a clear date where where people
And
have no choice.
do you know on tiny Gabriola Island, an organization called Sustainable Gabriola did just that. They were putting heat pumps in to reduce air pollution from wood smokes. But they did bulk purchase and they got people doing it. They installed 750 heat pumps on
Really?
Gabriola Island,
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
far more than the private market was doing in the Nanaimo larger region, because they took that determined local attitude to it.
I did not know that. That's a fantastic example.
Because otherwise people think, oh, a heat pump's expensive, but then they don't know what the rebates are. They haven't thought it through. But if you just have this, a ban, you ban all oil. I mean, homes heated by oil, for instance, you could sort of make oil tanks illegal as of 2 years ahead, and then put a tax on them if they're still there.
That's right.
In Brussels, the city said every new building must be a passive house building starting in 2015. That's 6 years ago. And they haven't had a single non-passive house, which is zero carbon, building since then.
Well, let me give you another example. The city of Vancouver with its climate emergency plan. I'm biased in this, of course, because my wife is the city councillor who brought in the climate emergency motion. But new buildings in Vancouver, either residential or commercial, will not be able to use natural gas for heat and water heating as of next year. Not 2032. Right.
Well, that's what we should do for the whole province.
Of course.
The whole of Canada.
Of course.
Yeah. What about transportation? I mean, how do we accelerate the urgency around bicycle lanes and free transit and stuff like that?
So, I mean, it's a combination of the measures. You have to put the alternative in place. So that's why building out the infrastructure around bike lanes and vehicle charging is so important. But you need those clear mandates. I think we should be signaling in law that you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle as of 2025. That's plenty of time. It's 5 years from now. And let me point out, and here's the nice example out of World War II. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. In the US of A, the center of car culture, which was already selling millions of civilian cars a year before the war, the production and sale of the private automobile became illegal for the next 4 years. That's how quickly we are capable of moving with that mindset.
So in basically 6 weeks, they made that transition.
Right.
Yeah. But today,
for it for a couple of years. But the key piece is, it wasn't the executives, and all those car factories were plenty busy, and those workers were pumping out military vehicles, but it wasn't the executives of the car companies in Detroit that decided. They were told what to do. And this is a key lesson out of the war. There was a big role for the private sector in military production in the US and in Canada, but the private sector didn't get to decide on the allocation of scarce resources, because in an emergency, you don't leave decisions like that to the market.
Yeah. So let me turn to the financing of all this, because some people say, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford it. And clearly in World War II, we afforded everything. We just got it done without anyone going bankrupt, and it all worked. So how would that work today for financing the climate transition?
Well, it could be broadly similarly, is the short answer. And C.D. Howe, who I mentioned earlier, when he was pressed about the level of spending to produce all of this stuff, he famously replied, if we lose the war, nothing will matter. And I think that's pretty much the attitude that we need to bring it to today. Let me answer it this way. First of all, as everyone knows, we've just spent a lot federally because of COVID. And the federal debt to GDP ratio is going to increase this year from roughly 30% to about 50%. That's a big jump in a single year. It still doesn't hold a candle to what we did in the Second World War, where the debt to GDP ratio at the end of the war was somewhere between 100 and 150%. And it did not spell economic ruin. Yeah. It actually marked the beginning of a 30-year period of record economic performance. So how did they do it? Well, they did it through a lot of debt spending, and they did it through the imposition of new taxes, particularly on upper income people and corporations. The corporate tax rate in World War II went from 18 to 40%. And they brought in an excess profits tax. They did it in the US and the UK as well. And that was important, not just for the income. It's important because when you are trying to mobilize all of society in common cause, you need social solidarity. And people need to know and feel like everyone is in and no one's profiteering. And so in the Second World War, there was no profiteering. What they did is they looked at the average profits in the 3 years before the war, the 4 years before the war. They averaged it out and they said to every company, large and small, that's your annual limit until this job is done, until the war is over. Once you hit that point, your top marginal tax rate was 100%. And so the kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic, which is rampant and grotesque, was illegal in the Second World War.
Yeah, the billionaires would be having a sort of different take if it was World War II for the way they're behaving at the moment. Yeah,
exactly.
So in Germany, public banks have been able to issue almost zero interest loans for investments like solar energy and wind turbines and housing retrofits. Could we do the same in Canada?
So I do think public banks could well be part of the solution. And I know I've loved what you've written about this over the years. But here's what we also have and are already doing. I mean, this is the great untold story of this pandemic, or at least undertold story of this pandemic. We have a national public bank. It's the Bank of Canada. It is a federal crown corporation. So not only are interest rates at historic lows of a fraction of 1%, where it just makes no sense not to be borrowing hand over fist right now, but almost all of the increase in debt from the federal government since the start of the pandemic, people know this year's deficit is going to be about $350 billion. Almost all of that is held by the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada has been buying up federal government securities at the rate of $5 billion a week at the start of the pandemic. The Bank of Canada holdings of federal debt have increased from about 15% to over 30% since March. It is incredible. What that simply lays bare, Guy, is that all of these years, when we have told there's not enough money for housing and homelessness, for poverty, for climate action, for transit, it's just been laid bare. The cat's out of the bag now. It's just shown us what was possible all along when we treat these things as a crisis.
My experiences in the climate activist realm is that very few climate activists or even environmentalists understand banking or public banking or central banking. They don't know what quantitative easing is. And they don't realize that a central bank can create money. It doesn't have to borrow money. It can create it. But it should only happen in an emergency. So this is getting into modern monetary theory. We won't go too long on this one. But if you create money all the time, you get inflation. But in an emergency, you can create the money as long as we can absorb it. And we're nowhere near inflation.
We're nowhere near inflation. The only risk is inflation, and that only happens if we're pushing the limits of our society's productive capacity. And there's no economist who thinks we're close to that. So we can do this.
The paradox of this, Seth, it's aside from the climate thing, is that the quantitative easing and central bank money went into the housing market, where there has been this terrible inflation causing the housing crisis, which is another side of this. But I want to come also to the importance of jobs on this one. But if we had to simultaneously tackle the climate crisis and build 100,000 new affordable homes every year, and if all those homes were built to the passive house standard, zero carbon, we're generating jobs while tackling the crisis and the housing crisis all at the same time.
That's exactly what we should be doing. So we should be prioritizing exactly those kinds of public expenditures on affordable zero-emission housing and on transit and on childcare and on renewables and retrofits, and it is all perfectly affordable.
And you did some polling for your book, specifically around some of these solutions, I was quite astonished when I read it, how much support there is to ordinary people saying, yes, do this stuff. Can you give us some numbers on that?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's interesting you say you were astonished, but it's telling also, which is that, there's a soft critique here of a lot of the environmental organizations. We have spent oodles of money and far too much time polling the wrong questions, asking people about incremental changes that are of no consequence. So that was annoying to me, and I wanted to try something in my poll with Abacus. Also, I kept interviewing politicians who claimed to get the climate crisis, but who kept falling back in one form or another on this line that, well, you have to meet the public where they're at, and the public isn't there yet. And I wanted to test if that was true. So I conducted this national poll with Abacus data, and I found it to be completely untrue. I found a public that is ahead of our politics when it comes to both their understanding of the emergency and their willingness to embrace and accept bold climate action. 62% of Canadians either see climate as an emergency already or will be within the next few years. And I polled on a range of bold climate actions, kind of the ones we've been talking about, like not allowing new buildings to tie into natural gas within 2 years, that kind of stuff. Stuff that no federal or provincial government has been willing to propose yet. And the levels of support and acceptance range from a low of 67% to a high of 84%. I mean, these are levels of support well beyond what any political party has.
And if I'm right, you're getting that support in Alberta as well.
Yeah, so when you break out these national numbers by province, they range from a high in Quebec, where the support for action is at the highest, to, as you might expect, a low in Alberta. But even in Alberta, the levels of support are strong. Even in Alberta, for example, 50% of Albertans said that they could accept that the extraction and export of fossil fuels had to end in the next 20 to 30 years, even though no government is suggesting such a thing. So I dig into the Alberta results because I think it's important not to paint Albertans with one broad brush, or to let Jason Kenney define the political culture of Alberta, because in fact it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. You also bring up a word that was used a lot in the run-up to World War II called appeasement, when people say, oh, Hitler's friendly, there's no harm, and blah, blah, blah. So you talk about some of the fossil fuel industries running the same kind of appeasement operation.
Yeah, this is a part of the call in the book, is to stop appeasing the fossil fuel corporations, because it has been part of what's slowing us down. Let's talk about our own province. Our own provincial government climate advisory council has representatives of the fossil fuel companies on it. It is important to the government to have come up with a climate plan that these folks could sign on to and support. Yeah. And what I'm saying in the book is, at this late hour, any climate plan that for which the membership of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers can find comfort is not a climate plan worth having. The climate plans we need now need to make them deeply, deeply anxious.
Well, just yesterday it was announced that the Trans-Canada pipeline would only be cost effective if Canada did not take further action to address the climate crisis. In other words, we keep the demand for oil running, keep the conventional vehicles running. If we move to electric vehicles, the financial argument for the pipeline collapses.
Yes, and that was from the parliamentary budget officer.
So talk to me about public engagement and youth engagement. We've got about 3 minutes left. How can young people and ordinary people take part in what's happening here?
Well, first of all, they already are. I mean, I think it's important to remind ourselves just how much momentum was building until the pandemic hit. I mean, a little over a year ago, there was 1 million Canadians on the street in response to a youth call for Climate Strike Day. And that is, as near as I can tell, the largest single day of protest in Canadian history. And it is youth-led. And similarly, I mentioned Vancouver's excellent climate emergency plan. Now, the interesting thing about those plans is that almost all of it has passed unanimously or near unanimously across a council that is very politically divided and where no party has a majority. Now, how did that happen? I like to say that it's clearly part of it is that my wife is very good at her job. But she would say that it happened because a whole bunch of students kept skipping school, protesting outside the council, speaking before council, filling the galleries, filling the virtual galleries in recent weeks when they couldn't physically gather, but still doing it in creative ways. And that those young people made it politically impossible for the councillors to vote no.
Right.
And that's what we need to replicate over and over again.
So we've got about 1 minute to wrap up here. What are your, for viewers, you can find the book. The book's called, again, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. Seth's website is simply sethklein.ca. And sort of, what do you want to share with viewers in wrap up, Seth?
Maybe I'll say this, and sorry, the sun has just come out here
brilliant,
in Vancouver,
brilliant. I can see that.
Now I see that I look a little odd as it comes through the window. Look, I guess I will say this in conclusion. We live in an ambiguous time. All of us and all your viewers who follow this stuff wrestle with despair about whether or not we can do this in time. And the book doesn't try to be Pollyanna about that. We don't know if we're going to do this in time. But one of the last of the many parallel examples I try to pull from that World War II story is a reminder that sounds obvious, except for the fact that we always forget. And it is this. In World War II, from a population at the time of a little over 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. That is a remarkable level of mobilization. But what we forget is that all of those million people who mobilized and enlisted 80 years ago to fight fascism, what they didn't know is if they would win. Yeah. We know how the story ended. Yeah. They did not. And they did what they had to do anyway. And they surprised themselves by what they accomplished. And that's what we need to do.
Yeah, cool. Seth, this has been great. I do urge viewers to get Seth's book, get it from a library, find it online, Good War. Thank you so much for sharing your years of research and hard work and all your efforts over the last 30 years as well. My name is Guy Dauncey. This has been the show Change the World, and look forward to another scintillating guest next week. Thanks for watching.